I've been working on the railroad, and I've got the bruises, the back pains, and the scars to prove it. Railway work was never easy. Take, for example, the handcar back in the day. This was your way to get around if you were on a section crew. Hand pumped, back braking, exposed to the elements, not very safe. There had to be a better way. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for sharing these videos with your friends, neighbors, relatives, and that cranky old guy down at the corner. When you share often. Make sure you like these and subscribe, and that helps the Railroad Museum a lot. The Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth at the St. Louis County Depot thanks you, and we hope to have some news soon about when we'll be reopening and the North Shore Scenic Railroad giving train rides again. So stay tuned for that important information. Meanwhile, making railroads safer for the employees is something that's always been foremost in the company's minds of late. Let's talk about some of the innovations that they did to the handcar. That better idea started in 1905 in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. The Roshold brothers began the Northwestern Steel and Iron Company, and they started making small, portable gasoline engines for a very successful line of portable cement mixers. It was a 4-horsepower model that was their most successful. And they were thinking about expanding. And in 1909, they came up with, I know, we'll put it on handcars. All they did was change the name of the motor to the Casey Jones motor. And all of a sudden, it had a railroad application. And that railroad application was converting existing handcars to now gas-powered motor cars. And the Northwestern Motor Car Company in Eau Claire, Wisconsin was building those kits. It was a kit that the railroad could buy that sold them everything they needed to replace the hand-pumping cars with a gas motor. And it sold for all of $85. It was pretty expensive back in those days, so the company even had a payment plan. Pay us $10 down and $5 a month, and you too can convert your hand pump car to a brand new state-of-the-art gas-powered car. In the 1920s, they started manufacturing the entire car, not just the motor, and they got bigger all the time. Their popular models were for single individuals, and that was the 535. And they made this model here, the 551. This was much better. This was called a gang car, and it would take a whole section crew to their construction site up and down the railroad. And it no longer had that little 4-horsepower Casey Jones motor in it. Oh no, this thing was powered by a 4-cylinder Model T Ford engine, and it could really move down the rails. And it did it safer and faster than the old hand pump cars. They weren't the only company making these, by the way. There were a bunch of them. Woodbury's, Buddha's, and one in Minnesota. In fact, the one in Minnesota bought out Northwestern in 1950s and formed the Fairmont Motor Car Company in Fairmont, Minnesota. Let's go there now. It's 1905. Frank Wade in Fairmont, Minnesota starts the Fairmont Machine Company, and he makes a small line of gas-powered motors that he sells for agricultural use around Minnesota and the Midwest. And he becomes quite successful at it. His 2-horsepower model is probably the best made motor in the Midwest. Now in 1909, Frank meets Fred Mullman Sr. Fred was a railway section hand. His job, pump the handcar. And he was tired of that back-breaking job. He thought if it was good enough to put a gas engine in a carriage and make an automobile, why couldn't they do the same thing for these old handcars and put a 2-horsepower motor on it? He goes to Frank. They start collaborating, and pretty soon, in 1909, the Fairmont Railway Car Company is formed. And they started making models like this at first, kind of manufacturing the same way that they did over at the Northwestern Steel and Iron Company in Eau Claire. Started as a kit, then they started making the whole unit, focusing on the engine that they made. Very interesting, though they made these wood ones for a long period of time, it was their next line of advances that actually started the motor company's claim to fame and their heyday. It was an inexpensive 1 or 2 person speeder, sometimes called a putt-putt. And the reason for that was they usually had just 1-cylinder engines, which fired, giving them the name putt-putt, or speeder, because it seemed like you were going so fast, being so close to the rails. You really weren't. The other thing you felt was the bumps. There's no suspension in these at all. You're riding right on the rails. But as you can see, all of a sudden there's a little more protection for the crew. These were very, very popular and made the Fairmont Motor Company the largest selling putt-putt, speeder, and trackmobile manufacturer in the country in its day. But that day ended. And that day was 1979, when the Fairmont Railway Motor Company was finally merged for the very last time into its own non-existence. And for almost 70 years, the manufacture of the motor car, the putt-putt, the speeder, came to an end. And the reason it did was this invention, the high rail mechanism. Here, you could add this to any vehicle at all, making it a railway car. You could put it on a pickup truck, a dump truck. You could put it on our Erie Mining inspection car that we showed you earlier. Well, the high rail replaced the putt-putt, but they live on. Here in Duluth, Minnesota, every year, Mike Ford brings his members of the North American Rail Car Owners Association to Duluth as they travel all over the country to continue their putt-putt extravaganza tours. They find railways like the North Shore Scenic Railroad that allows them to get together, share some great times, some wonderful memories, and then explore the railroad on their multicolored putt-putt cars. Now, as you can see, some modifications have been made over the years. These really didn't come with horns or spotlights or, for that matter, bucket seats. But boy, do they have fun. And as I say, you can find out more about them. They'll be coming back to the North Shore Scenic Railroad this summer, and we welcome them each and every year. Meanwhile, remember what I told you. Always wash your hands, cover your coughs, don't touch your face. If you're sick, stay home and do it. Let's take care of each other.